All right, let's dive deep into something really interesting today. India's defense strategy and how it's evolving.
Yeah.
And this is particularly important for, well, anyone interested in geopolitics,
Okay.
but definitely for those UPSC aspirants out there.
Absolutely.
So to help us break it all down, we have two fantastic experts with us today. Mata, Senior Fellow and Director of International Studies, and Martin, Head of the Taiwan Office at the European Values Center for Security Policy.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So to kind of set the stage, recently we saw both German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Spanish PM Pedro Sanchez visit India. And these were high-profile visits.
Oh, yeah.
And not just your typical diplomatic meet and greet. These were all about defense deals.
Exactly.
Time. So Scholz, for example, he was spotted visiting a German frigate and supply ship in Goa.
Mm.
And then Sanchez inaugurated India's very first privately run aircraft manufacturing facility.
Wow.
It's a joint venture, actually, between Airbus Spain and India's Tata Group, and they're going to be building the Airbus C-295 planes for the Indian Air Force.
And what's really interesting is that both Germany and Spain, they're also in the running to supply India with air-independent propulsion submarines.
Now, these submarines, those are a game changer, right? They can stay underwater way longer than conventional subs.
That's right.
Makes them much harder to detect.
Exactly.
And this is especially important, I think, given the growing maritime tensions, in the Indo-Pacific.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in that region. It's a big deal.
Huge. And, all of this is really a sign of a pretty significant shift in India's approach to defense.
Mm-hmm.
For decades, they've depended so heavily on Russia for military equipment, but now things are changing.
Absolutely.
The Russia-Ukraine war, I think, has been a major catalyst here.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because with Russia's military really focused on their own conflict,
Right.
it's become a lot harder for India to count on them as a reliable supplier.
Right.
So for the first time since the 1960s, actually, imports of weapons from Russia fell below 50% of India's total procurement.
That's a huge shift.
It's huge. And this has led India to really diversify its partnerships.
Yeah.
Which, fits in really well with Prime Minister Modi's vision of multi-alignment.
Right, exactly. Not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And instead, forging these relationships with different countries to serve their various economic and strategic interests.
Right.
And European nations, Germany in particular, they seem really keen to strengthen these ties with India.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Germany sees India as, this key player in the region and potentially a counterbalance to China's growing influence.
Right.
So defense and security cooperation with China is practically, impossible right now. And then attracting skilled workers from China has become increasingly difficult.
Yeah.
So India becomes this very attractive alternative partner.
Okay, so this is where things get interesting, especially for our UPSC folks getting ready for those exams. Both India and the EU, they're really emphasizing self-reliance when it comes to their defense industries. So India has, Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat, both focused on domestic production.
Right.
And then the EU wants to source, a high percentage of its defense equipment from within Europe by 2030.
So it raises the question, can these two seemingly conflicting goals, like domestic production and international partnerships, can they really coexist?
Yeah, it's a real tension point to keep an eye on, for sure.
Absolutely.
And of course, we can't talk about all of this without mentioning the big one, China. Clearly, Germany's growing interest in India is driven, at least in part, by worries about China's assertiveness.
Oh, yeah.
But with potential elections in Germany on the horizon and, the current government in maybe a slightly shaky position, could that focus on India change, do you think?
That's a fair question.
Yeah.
However, from what we're seeing, this move away from a China-centric approach, it feels like it's more of a structural change in German foreign policy, one that's likely to stick around regardless of who's in charge. In fact, Mata even suggests that a new government might actually speed up this diversification, even faster deepening of ties with India.
So in a way, you could say that China is actually pushing Germany and India closer together.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating twist.
Yeah, it is. Now let's shift gears a bit and focus on the maritime dimension of the Indo-Pacific. As we all know, this region is crucial. It's critical for global security and really shapes defense policy.
Absolutely. And with China steadily increasing its presence in the Indian Ocean, India's role in safeguarding maritime security has become even more vital, wouldn't you say?
Oh, for sure. And we've seen China making those strategic investments in ports in Sri Lanka, Gwadar, Pakistan, which, many analysts view as kind of a way to encircle India with those Chinese maritime assets.
Right.
And in response to that, India is prioritizing modernizing its navy, especially when it comes to submarines, like those air-independent propulsion ones we were talking about earlier.
Right. It's all about maintaining that credible deterrent against China's growing naval power.
Exactly. It's a really complex kind of strategic dance going on there. It shows how interconnected all these geopolitical moves really are.
Absolutely.
Now, there's something that might seem on the surface like a positive development. That's the recent border deal that was struck between India and China just before that BRICS summit in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it's a step towards easing tensions. But, does it really address the core issues between these two giants?
Well, we have to remember what happened in 2020, right? The Galwan Valley incident,
Right.
China's actions there, they led to a major reset in how India approaches China, and it pushed them even further towards diversifying their partnerships.
So this border agreement, while it is a positive step, it doesn't erase that deep mistrust or that strategic rivalry that exists between the two.
Exactly. Tensions, they're likely to continue even with this agreement in place.
Now, Germany's also said that they want to strengthen military cooperation with India, aiming for a more permanent footing between their armed forces,
That's right.
which sounds like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it is. But as Martin points out, there are some potential concerns. For example, the biggest client for India's defense industry right now is the military junta in Myanmar,
Oh, right.
which, as we know, has a pretty questionable human rights record.
That's a really important point.
Mm-hmm.
It shows how ethically complex it can be to deepen military ties with India,
Yes.
because it could unintentionally lead to strategic technologies ending up in the hands of actors like the Myanmar regime.
It's a reminder that these relationships are rarely black and white. There are always shades of gray and potential unintended consequences that we have to consider.
Yeah, that's a great point. And speaking of complex relationships, let's talk about India's long-standing ties with Moscow. This has been a particularly sensitive topic, especially with the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Oh, absolutely. And the U.S. and its allies, they've been very vocal about their concerns over India's close relationship with Russia, which, given the current geopolitical situation, it is understandable.
Yeah, for instance, in October 2024, India was the second largest buyer of Russian fossil fuels, which, that directly contributes to Russia's export earnings and potentially even helps fund their war effort.
Right.
But it's not as simple as it might seem at first glance.
No, it's not. We also have to remember that India has become the biggest exporter of oil products to the EU.
Right.
And Chancellor Scholz himself actually suggested that India, with its long and historically reliable relations with Russia, could actually help mediate the conflict in Ukraine.
So it seems like the EU is moving towards more nuanced understanding of India's position.
I think so, yeah. There's definitely been a shift from that earlier, more critical stance.
Yeah, for sure. But then there's another layer of complexity. That's the issue of potential Indian transfers of dual-use technology to the Russian arms industry.
Right. This has become a potential sticking point in Europe-India relations as it directly impacts European security. And U.S. intelligence, they estimate that Indian technology worth around $60 million per month actually flowed to Russia in April and May of 2024. It's a substantial amount, but it is worth noting that it's still significantly smaller than China's transfers of dual-use technology to Russia.
Right.
And in fairness to India, they have acknowledged those issues with export control enforcement and compliance by Indian companies. Their response to these concerns has been relatively positive, but it's definitely something that needs to be addressed effectively so it doesn't strain relations with Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's hard to ignore the perception of double standards at play here. While the EU has criticized India for buying oil from Russia, many EU countries themselves benefited from, those discounted Russian energy supplies before the war and even during the initial phases of the conflict.
Right. Even some of the strongest supporters of Ukraine within the EU, countries like Poland and the Czech Republic, they took advantage of those cheap Russian oil and gas supplies.
Yeah.
And let's not forget those exemptions that were granted to some Central European countries from sanctions on Russian crude oil.
Right. All of these inconsistencies understandably make relations between the EU and the global South, including India, more complicated.
Absolutely. But it is encouraging to see the EU adopt a less lecturing and a more pragmatic approach when they engage with India. They seem to be acknowledging the complexities involved.
Yeah, it's a welcome shift from that purely normative approach to something more practical and understanding.
Definitely.
And it's really important, I think, to draw that clear distinction between India's relationship with Russia and China's support for Russia.
Absolutely, it's crucial. NATO classifies China as a critical enabler of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They've been very active in their public diplomacy to legitimize the invasion.
Right.
They've directly supported the Russian arms industry, and they've implemented economic policies designed to bolster the Russian economy.
Right. And none of this is happening at the same level with India. While there are concerns, about the India-Russia relationship, this key difference allows for the continued development of, a strong and positive relationship between Europe and India.
Yeah. It's all about understanding the nuances of these relationships and recognizing that not all engagements are created equal.
Exactly. And now let's bring in another major player into the mix, the United States.
Okay.
So the U.S. recently imposed sanctions on certain Indian companies for, their part in enabling Russia's war effort.
Hmm.
And this, combined with the broader trend of kind of a U.S. disengagement from that traditional global leadership role, it's prompting countries like India to look for those alternative partnerships.
Right.
And then we can't forget the impact of the Trump presidency and his protectionist policies, like those threats of tariffs on global imports, create a lot of uncertainty for both the EU and India, pushing them to search for more reliable and stable partners.
Yeah, that uncertain U.S. environment is definitely accelerating the search for alternative alliances.
The EU itself is facing some tough decisions. They're worried about China potentially becoming the largest trading partner, especially with those looming threats of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods.
It's a delicate balancing act for the EU. They're caught in the middle between the U.S. and China, all while trying to advance their own economic security agenda.
Yeah.
It seems that most experts agree that despite some internal disagreements, the EU's economic security goals and their strong transatlantic orientation are likely to lead to a more coordinated transatlantic approach to China. It might not be a perfect alignment, but they'll find some common ground.
hmm And as the U.S. shifts its focus more towards the Indo-Pacific, European countries are actively trying to strengthen ties elsewhere, including with India.
You see that even with Poland, which has strong pro-U.S. leanings, they are working to elevate their relationship with India to a strategic partnership.
So it seems like the European push towards the Indo-Pacific isn't solely driven by transatlantic tensions. It's also about recognizing India's growing importance globally and aligning with a power that shares their strategic interests.
It's a multifaceted dynamic, with each player making their moves based on their own calculations and priorities.
And it really leads to this intriguing question. As the U.S. seems to be stepping back from its traditional global role, could we see a stronger EU-India partnership emerge as a way to counterbalance China's growing influence?
That's a question with huge implications for the future of global power dynamics. We'll explore this further in our next segment.
Yeah, stay tuned for that. We'll dive even deeper into these fascinating aspects of India's evolving defense strategy.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've been talking about, high-level shifts and partnerships, but let's get into some specifics now, especially for those of you following along, for UPSC preparation. This next part is going to be particularly relevant.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the big geopolitical picture, but these defense deals, they have real-world consequences for India's military capabilities.
Oh, absolutely. Take those air-independent propulsion submarines, for example. Getting those would be a major leap forward for India's Navy. They're so much stealthier and have a far greater range than the traditional diesel-electric submarines, which gives India, a real edge, particularly in underwater warfare.
Yeah, it's a big deal. I mean, it means they can patrol for longer periods without having to surface, which
Yeah.
makes them way harder for anyone to detect.
Exactly.
And this is especially important with, China's growing naval presence in the Indian Ocean.
Absolutely. It's all about having a credible deterrent. And then there are those Airbus C-295 planes that we mentioned earlier.
Right.
Those will significantly boost India's tactical airlift capabilities.
Yeah, those are super versatile aircraft, great for transporting troops and equipment, even in tough environments, like the Himalayas, where India shares that disputed border with China.
Exactly. These deals aren't just about, getting fancy new weapons. They're about addressing specific security needs and filling in those gaps in India's defense posture.
It's a very targeted approach, I think, to modernizing and diversifying, equipping India to handle a whole range of potential threats. And let's not forget about the economic benefits that come with these deals.
Of course.
Like that joint venture between, Airbus Spain and India's Tata Group to build the C-295 planes. That's going to create jobs and really boost India's domestic aerospace industry.
It's a win-win. India gets the hardware it needs, and it strengthens its own industrial base at the same time.
Now, I know some of you might be wondering why all of this emphasis on defense and security is so important right now.
Well, as we talked about earlier, there's this sense that the U.S., which has traditionally been the global security guarantor, is stepping back from that role.
Right.
And that creates a vacuum that other powers, particularly China, are, well, they're ready to fill.
And so countries like India, they're realizing that they need to step up, be more responsible for their own security, and make some tough choices about who they partner with.
Exactly.
And one of those tough choices is, how do you manage that relationship with Russia?
It's tricky. India's got these long-standing ties with Moscow, but that relationship is definitely getting more strained as the West continues to isolate Russia because of the war in Ukraine.
Right.
India's walking a tightrope, trying to keep those historical ties with Russia while building stronger relationships with Western nations.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
It requires, some very skillful diplomacy and some really strategic thinking. And for those of you hoping to join the Indian Foreign Service one day, this is exactly the type of challenge that you'll be facing.
Absolutely. The things we're discussing today, they're crucial for understanding how complex international relations are and the unique challenges that India's up against in this ever-changing global landscape.
It's about being able to see the whole board, understanding everyone's motivations, predicting where those potential flashpoints might be. And it's about being able to analyze information critically and coming up with effective policy responses.
You got it.
It's about having the knowledge and the confidence to navigate a world where the old rules just don't apply anymore.
The world's changing, and India's role in it is changing too.
And we're seeing those changes on so many different levels: military, economic, diplomatic.
It's like a multi-dimensional chess game, and India's playing it with increasing skill and sophistication.
Yeah, they're forming new partnerships, diversifying their capabilities, and really asserting themselves as a major player on the world stage.
This is just the beginning. The next decade will be absolutely crucial for India, and the choices they make, well, they'll have a huge impact on the whole world.
We've covered a lot, but we've really only just scratched the surface. In the final part, we'll be looking at some even more interesting aspects of India's evolving defense strategy, like, their growing focus on things like space and cyber warfare.
It's going to be fascinating.
All right, we're back for the last part of our deep dive on India's defense strategy. We've talked about, the more traditional forces like submarines and fighter jets and all that complex diplomacy India has to handle. But there's another side to all this, something really cutting edge.
You're right. It's not just about land, sea, and air anymore. These days, modern defense strategy has to consider two new battlegrounds: space and cyberspace.
Exactly. Space isn't just, science fiction anymore. It's become totally crucial for things like communication, navigation, intelligence. It's essential.
And more, people are seeing it as a potential area for conflict. We're talking anti-satellite weapons, the risk of space debris, the whole militarization of space. It's serious stuff.
So where does India fit into all of this?
Well, India has actually been quietly building its space capabilities for decades. They have a very well-established space program with a proven track record of launching satellites for all sorts of purposes: Earth observation, communication, navigation, you name it.
And we can't forget that India is one of the few countries that's actually tested an anti-satellite weapon. That really showed they're serious about their space capabilities.
It was a controversial move, but it makes it clear that India is committed to protecting its interests in space. They're not just sitting back and watching, they're developing ways to defend themselves in this new arena.
And then there's cyberspace, which has become, its own kind of battlefield. You've got state-sponsored hackers, cyber espionage everywhere, and even the possibility of devastating cyber attacks that could cripple essential infrastructure.
Absolutely. And this is where India faces some real challenges. Their digital economy is huge and growing fast, but their cybersecurity infrastructure is still lagging behind.
Which makes them vulnerable, right? Attacks could come from states or, non-state actors. We've already seen cases of cyber attacks on Indian government institutions and businesses.
India is working on strengthening its cyber defenses, but they've got a lot of catching up to do. Investing in a strong cybersecurity infrastructure, training a skilled cyber workforce, and working with other countries to combat these threats, these are all top priorities.
It's a race against time almost. Technology keeps advancing and the ways of fighting are evolving with it. India needs to be ready to fight on all these fronts: land, sea, air, space. cyberspace.
It's a multi-domain challenge that really requires a comprehensive and integrated approach.
And this is where that idea of multi-alignment comes in again. It's not just about buying weapons or tech. India is looking to partner with countries that can help them build their capabilities in these new areas, space and cyberspace.
We've seen them collaborate with countries like the US, Israel, France, and Japan on these initiatives, sharing knowledge, doing joint exercises, working together to figure out the rules of the road in these new and often uncharted territories.
It's that realization that in today's world, you can't go it alone. Security is something you share, it's a responsibility for everyone, and strong partnerships are essential.
That's right. And that's a really important point for all of us, whether we're involved in policy making or analysis, or even just as engaged citizens. We need to look beyond those traditional boundaries and work together on security.
The threats today, they cross borders, they're complex.
Hmm.
We need collective responses, working together, sharing information, building trust.
It's about recognizing that our security is interconnected. What happens in one part of the world affects everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on India's changing defense strategy, we want to leave you with this thought. The world is transforming quickly, and India is changing right along with it. They're stepping onto the global stage, taking on more responsibility, and charting their own path. The choices they make are going to have a big impact, not just on the Indo-Pacific region, but globally.
It's a dynamic situation, and understanding all this is really crucial for anyone who's interested in what's happening in the world. Especially, of course, for those of you studying for those UPSC exams. Keep learning, stay engaged, and delve deeper into the topics that really matter to you.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll be back soon with another deep dive on a topic that matters. Until then, keep exploring.